Zodiac Killer, the unsolved darkness. The moon hung low over the fog-drenched streets of San Francisco, casting a dim, eerie glow over the city. It was a calm night, the kind that would lull anyone into a false sense of security, but beneath the quiet surface, something wicked was stirring. It was December 1968 when the first whispers of fear began to rise. A couple, high school sweethearts, were parked on a deserted road on the outskirts of Vallejo, California, a place where the dark seemed to stretch forever, and the night air was thick with the scent of pine and solitude. Betty Lou Jensen, just 16, sat in the passenger seat, her boyfriend, David Faraday, a few years older, behind the wheel. Their evening was supposed to be simple, just a quiet drive, a little escape from the chaos of the world. But their night, their lives, would end in bloodshed, the beginning of a nightmare no one would ever escape. The gunshots rang out through the empty night, the sound sharp and jagged against the stillness. In an instant, their lives were over. David's body crumpled in the driver's seat, while Betty Lou was found lying in the grass, lifeless, the blood soaking into the earth beneath her. Whoever had done this had disappeared without a trace, leaving nothing behind but death. It was weeks before the first taunting letter appeared. Dear editor, I am the killer of the two teenagers last Christmas at Lake Herman. The words were cold, calculated, and chilling, the ink just as dark as the mind that penned them. The letter, though brief, would be only the beginning of a series of cryptic messages, each one more twisted and disturbing than the last. A killer had emerged from the shadows, and he was just getting started. From the very beginning, the Zodiac Killer was unlike any other murderer the authorities had encountered. Not only was he brutal and remorseless, but he reveled in the terror he caused. His letters to the press were riddled with cryptic codes, some of which were never solved, their meaning locked away in the twisted labyrinth of the killer's mind. The Zodiac didn't just want to kill. He wanted to play with his victims, to taunt the police, to make the public tremble in fear. His first letter had been chilling in its brevity, but it was the second one that truly left the authorities scrambling for answers. I want you to print this cipher on the front page of your paper. It will help me with my plans. I am not afraid of the gas chamber, because it will send me to paradise all the sooner. I will not give you my name, because you will find it easy to get, and if you do, I will be glad to see you die. I am a murderer of children. The letter was signed with a symbol, an unholy cross of sorts, its sharp angles and twisted lines an eerie reflection of the darkness within. And so began the twisted game. The Zodiac Killer continued to kill, his reign of terror spreading across Northern California, leaving a trail of bodies and riddles behind. Each murder seemed meticulously planned, as if he enjoyed orchestrating the fear that gripped the community. But it wasn't just the killings that made the Zodiac so infamous. It was his ability to evade capture, his cryptic messages, and the sense that he was always one step ahead of the law. For years, the Zodiac seemed invincible. No one could catch him. No one knew who he was. He could have been anyone. He could have been standing right next to you in line at the grocery store, or sitting across from you on a bus. He could have been anyone, and that was the true horror of it. The question lingered like an unanswered prayer. Who was the Zodiac Killer? Was it a man driven by madness? A methodical genius with a twisted sense of power? Or was it something darker, still, a force that could not be understood by the human mind, something outside the realm of comprehension? As the years went by, the murders stopped, but the Zodiac's letters, his games, didn't. They became more erratic, more bizarre, until eventually they too faded away into the cold, distant silence of history. I am not afraid of death. I will die with a smile on my face. Those words haunted the police officers who were trying to piece together the puzzle, who spent years chasing a ghost that they could never catch. But what if the ghost was still out there? What if the Zodiac Killer was not some random murderer who had faded into the past, but someone who still lurked in the shadows, waiting to strike again? It had been decades since the Zodiac's last known crime. The case had gone cold, with no new clues and no fresh leads. But with every new piece of information that surfaced, the possibility of solving the case grew more distant, more elusive. The cipher that had once been unsolvable was now viewed as a challenge, a riddle that had yet to be answered. But the Zodiac was always watching. He had never stopped playing his game. The city was quieter than usual that night, a stillness so thick it felt suffocating. The streets, usually filled with the hum of late-night cars and the occasional footstep of someone coming home, were eerily empty. But somewhere in the dark, someone was watching. It had been almost a year since the Zodiac's last known killings. The police were still reeling from the brutal double murder at Lake Herman Road, trying to piece together the fragments of a case that seemed to lead nowhere. And then, just as the case was about to fade into cold history, something unexpected happened. Another letter arrived. This time, the letter was more cryptic than before. The Zodiac's handwriting was a chilling mixture of slashes and loops. Like a warped version of calligraphy, a twisted signature left in the shadows. It was the first sign that the Zodiac was not done, that he was not just playing games, he was sending a message. This is the Zodiac speaking. I have grown tired of your feeble efforts to catch me. I have given you my clues, and yet you still cannot see. Your greatest mistake was not recognizing me for what I am. I will continue to kill until you finally understand. The words were almost casual in their tone, a stark contrast to the horror they described. The letter was signed with the Zodiac symbol, a grotesque cross of sorts, sharp and jagged, as if drawn by a hand that reveled in violence. At first, the police thought it was just another of the Zodiac's twisted games. But when they examined the letter closely, they noticed something that would make their blood run cold. Embedded within the message was a cipher, another puzzle, another challenge. The Zodiac was taunting them, not just with his words, but with his very presence. The police were no longer chasing a murderer. They were chasing a ghost, an entity that had learned to control the narrative, to hold power over those who sought to stop him. Days turned into weeks, and the search for the Zodiac Killer continued. The police worked tirelessly, scrutinizing every clue, every letter. But the Zodiac seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. He was a specter in the fog, a phantom that appeared when least expected, only to vanish just as quickly. Then, in the early hours of July 4th, 1969, the killer struck again. This time, he targeted two young lovers, Darlene Farron and Michael Mageau, who were parked at a secluded spot near Blue Rock Springs. The place was far from any major road, hidden in the dense woods, where the only sound was the rustle of leaves in the wind. The killer approached their car silently, as though he had been waiting for hours. The flash of headlights was the only warning. Without a word, he pulled out a handgun and opened fire. Darlene was hit first, her screams piercing the night air. Michael, though injured, managed to crawl away from the car, but not before the Zodiac saw him. The killer approached him, standing over him as if deciding whether or not to finish the job. Then, as if bored by the whole affair, the Zodiac turned and walked back to his car, driving off into the darkness without a trace. It was another execution, another senseless killing that left behind more questions than answers. But this time, something had changed. Michael Mageau survived the attack, barely. When he regained consciousness, he was able to provide the police with a description of his attacker. But the description was vague, incomplete, and full of contradictions. The Zodiac had masked his identity well, wearing a disguise that made him nearly impossible to identify. The letter came a week later. Dear editor, I am the one who killed the couple at Blue Rock Springs. I am not afraid of the law. You cannot stop me. I will kill again, just as I did before. There was no fear in his words, no remorse, just an unshakable certainty. It was a declaration, a proclamation of his invincibility. And for the people of Northern California, it was a message that struck at the very heart of their safety. They were no longer just living their lives. They were being watched by a predator who could strike at any time, in any place. The next months were filled with tension. Everyone was on edge. The Zodiac had become an urban legend, a monster in the dark that could be anyone, anywhere. The authorities were desperate, but no one seemed to have any leads. The Zodiac's pattern was erratic, unpredictable, and yet, somehow, each crime seemed deliberate, as if he was playing a game and he was always one step ahead. But the Zodiac was not finished. No, the true horror was just beginning. On the night of September 27th, 1969, the Zodiac would make his most infamous mark. He struck again, this time at Lake Berryessa, a serene spot that was known for its peaceful beauty. It was supposed to be a day of relaxation, a day for a couple to enjoy the quiet, tranquil waters. But the Zodiac had other plans. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Ann Shepard were relaxing by the shore, unaware that their lives were about to be ripped apart. As they sat, chatting casually, a man approached them. Dressed in an unusual outfit, a hooded cloak with a symbol of a cross emblazoned on the front, and a round hood with eye holes cut out. He looked like something out of a nightmare, and for Brian and Cecilia, the nightmare was about to begin. The Zodiac, now known to the public, approached the couple with an air of cold certainty. He ordered them to lie down on the ground. Then, with terrifying calmness, he drew a knife and began to tie them up. He spoke to them, telling them that he was the Zodiac, the killer of the other victims, and that he was going to kill them both. They begged for their lives, but the Zodiac showed no mercy. He attacked them, stabbing them repeatedly, but not killing them right away. The fear, the pain, the horror was unbearable. Cecilia Ann survived the attack, but Brian Hartnell was left for dead. The Zodiac, satisfied with his work, calmly walked away. Before he left, he carved the same symbol into Hartnell's car door, a grotesque reminder of who had done this. And as he left, he turned and disappeared into the night, his figure vanishing into the trees, leaving only terror in his wake. The police found the scene moments later, but the Zodiac was already gone. A few hours later, he sent another letter to the press, proudly taking responsibility for the attack, as if he was sharing a secret. I am the murderer of Brian and Cecilia. I will keep on killing until you catch me. The wind howled through the streets of San Francisco, rattling the windows in their frames as if echoing the unease that hung in the air. The Zodiac Killer had struck again, and with each passing day, the fear seemed to grow. No one knew when he would appear next, or where, or who would be next in his cruel, twisted game. The police were no closer to solving the case than they had been months ago. The clues he left were as elusive as smoke, slipping through their fingers no matter how hard they tried to catch them. The Zodiac's letters continued to taunt the authorities, each one more cryptic and mocking than the last. He reveled in the confusion, the fear, and the sense of power that came with his anonymity. The first letter, after the Lake Berryessa attack, was the most chilling yet. It was different from the others in tone, more personal, more deranged. The Zodiac, with his strange obsession for puzzles and codes, included yet another cipher, this one more complex than the last. He seemed to enjoy the game, challenging the police and the public alike to crack his code, all the while knowing that they might never solve it. I hope you enjoy yourselves trying to catch me. I will not give you my name, for it is no use. You will never know who I am. But I will leave you my mark, my symbol. You will see it in your dreams. The words were chilling, each one dripping with a sense of finality. The Zodiac knew that no one could stop him. He was untouchable, a shadow in the night that could not be grasped. As the weeks turned into months, the Zodiac continued his reign of terror, his actions more brazen and his letters more menacing. The investigation grew more frantic, and yet the police found themselves trapped in a labyrinth of dead ends. Every suspect they brought in was dismissed, every lead turned to dust. It seemed as though the Zodiac had disappeared into thin air, and yet the letters continued to arrive, each one more filled with contempt for the law than the last. Then, in early 1970, a break in the case came from an unexpected source. A cryptologist from the Navy, Donald Hardin, was the one who cracked the Zodiac's most infamous cipher, the 340-character cipher, which had stumped experts for months. When the message was finally decoded, it revealed something horrifying. I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me. That wasn't me on the TV show, which brings up a point about me. I am not afraid of the gas chamber, because it will send me to paradise all the sooner. Because I now have enough slaves to work for me. The words were chilling, but it was the final sentence that left a lingering sense of dread. I now have enough slaves to work for me. The Zodiac's obsession with power and control was becoming clearer. He wasn't just a killer, he was a man who reveled in the idea of domination, in having others dance to his twisted tune. He saw himself as a god, an untouchable force, playing a game with the lives of those unfortunate enough to cross his path. As the months wore on, the murders slowed, but the letters never stopped. The Zodiac taunted the police, continuing to send messages and ciphers, each one more bizarre and menacing than the last. In 1974, he sent another letter to the San Francisco Chronicle, claiming responsibility for yet another murder that had never been confirmed. I have lived in this city for years, and I am becoming more and more familiar with the layout. You will never catch me. I am too smart for you. I will continue to kill, and there is nothing you can do to stop me. But despite the Zodiac's confidence, something had changed. The murders had stopped. The letters stopped coming. It was as though he had vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and a chilling legacy. Was he still out there? Had he moved on to another city, another victim? Or had he truly disappeared, never to be heard from again? The police couldn't say for sure. The case was left hanging in the balance, unsolved, like so many before it. And yet, the myth of the Zodiac Killer continued to grow, fueled by the fear and mystery he left behind. The final game. It was 1978 when the final letter arrived. The police were no longer chasing a murderer. They were chasing a ghost. The Zodiac had stopped killing, stopped writing, stopped everything. The fear he had instilled in the hearts of millions had lingered, but there were no more bodies, no more ciphers, no more clues. This is the Zodiac speaking. I have finished my work. I have no more to prove. You will never catch me, but you will never forget me. The letter was short, to the point, and yet it was the most terrifying one of all. In those few words, the Zodiac had claimed victory. He had created a fear that would last forever, a mystery that would never be solved. The killer had escaped, and in the end, that was his true triumph. As the years went by, the case of the Zodiac Killer grew colder. The police investigation faded into the background, becoming just another unsolved mystery, another name on a list of cold cases. But the fear remained, lingering in the shadows, a reminder that evil could exist in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the monsters you fear are the ones you can never catch. The Zodiac Killer had left a permanent mark on the world, a mark that would never fade. He was a symbol of terror, a reminder that some puzzles are meant to remain unsolved. His identity remained a mystery, and as time passed, the fear of the unknown began to settle deep into the hearts of those who had followed the case. The days turned into weeks, then months. The Zodiac Killer, once a fearsome presence in the minds of the people of Northern California, had faded into the background like a shadow at dusk. No new murders, no new letters, no fresh leads. The police had no idea where he was, if he was still alive, or if he had truly vanished forever. The case, despite all its chilling details, had become just another cold file on a detective's desk, buried under the weight of time. But even as the world moved on, the name Zodiac still lingered in the air, in the dark corners of the mind. His identity remained a mystery. The letters, filled with strange codes and riddles, still haunted the memories of those who had dared to try and solve them. His taunting words echoed in the minds of investigators, who could not shake the feeling that the Zodiac was always watching, waiting for the right moment to strike again. In the years following the last confirmed attack in 1969, whispers began to surface. Were there other victims, other murders that the Zodiac had committed that had never been attributed to him? Had he been active in other cities, other states? Theories abounded, but with no solid evidence, they remained just that, theories. But then, in 1976, something strange happened. The police received a tip, an anonymous call that sent chills down their spines. The caller claimed to have information about the Zodiac Killer. The tip was vague, cryptic, but the caller seemed to know things that only someone involved in the case could know. The tip led to a re-examination of cold cases, unsolved murders that in hindsight seemed eerily similar to the Zodiac's modus operandi. There was a pattern, a trail of death stretching far beyond the borders of Northern California. From Oregon to Nevada, there were stories of mysterious murders, victims found in isolated areas, shot or stabbed with no apparent motive. And as the police dug deeper, they found clues. Fragments of the Zodiac's cryptic letters, pieces of a puzzle that had never been put together before. Detective John M. Lee, who had been working on the Zodiac case for years, was among those who began re-examining these old cases. He was haunted by the idea that they had missed something, that the Zodiac had slipped through their fingers yet again. On a crisp autumn morning, Lee stood at the edge of a small, quiet town in Oregon, staring at the crime scene of an unsolved murder that had occurred just a year after the last confirmed Zodiac killing. The body of a young woman had been found in a wooded area, her death brutal and senseless. There were no witnesses, no evidence, just a trail of blood leading into the trees. But something about the scene felt familiar. The placement of the body, the method of the attack, the sense of ritual. The Zodiac had been active again. Lee couldn't shake the feeling that this was the same killer, the same twisted mind at work. This murder and several others in nearby towns fit the Zodiac's pattern too perfectly to be a coincidence. It was as though the killer had returned, slipping back into the shadows after years of silence. But why? Why had he stopped for so long, only to resurface now? The tip from the anonymous caller weighed heavily on Lee's mind. What if the Zodiac had been hiding in plain sight all these years? What if the killer was someone who had been close to the investigation all along? Could the Zodiac have known things that only a police officer or a close associate would know? The possibility that the killer had remained in the area, or even within the ranks of law enforcement, was a terrifying thought. As the investigation into the new murders grew, the similarities to the Zodiac's previous crimes became undeniable. There were the same twisted signatures, the same cryptic messages left at the scene, just as the Zodiac had done years before. Even the way the victims were chosen, young couples, alone in secluded areas, was too precise to be a coincidence. The tension in the police department grew. The Zodiac was no longer a name from the past, a myth whispered among the public. He was real, and he had returned. In 1977, the Zodiac made his reappearance, this time in the form of another letter. This one was as cold and menacing as all the others, but there was something different about it. The words seemed sharper, more direct, almost as if the Zodiac knew he was being watched, as if he was savoring the knowledge that the authorities were closing in on him. I have watched you for years. You have searched for me, but I have always been right in front of you. I am everywhere, and I will never leave. You think you can catch me, but you cannot. I will continue to kill, and there is nothing you can do to stop me. The letter was signed, as always, with the Zodiac's symbol, the grotesque cross, twisted and sharp, a mark of pure evil. For Detective Lee, this letter felt different. It was as though the Zodiac was playing with him directly, testing his every move. It was clear now, the Zodiac didn't just want to kill, he wanted to destroy. He wanted to tear apart the fabric of society, to make people question everything they thought they knew about safety, about the world around them. Lee felt the weight of the case bearing down on him. He had to stop the Zodiac. He had to. But the more he investigated, the more he realized just how deep the killer's reach went. The Zodiac was a master of manipulation, a man who knew how to pull the strings of those around him, to hide in plain sight. The investigation took a dark turn when a breakthrough came in the form of a confession, but not from the Zodiac himself. It came from a man named James Hall, a suspect from the original investigation who had been dismissed years ago. Hall had been in prison for a different crime when he suddenly came forward, claiming to know the identity of the Zodiac. "I know who he is," Hall said in a hushed voice during a prison interview. "I've known for years. He's still out there. And if you don't stop him, he'll keep killing." But Hall's confession wasn't as simple as it seemed. His story was full of contradictions, and the police were left to wonder if he was simply seeking attention or if he was telling the truth. The Zodiac's identity remained elusive, the case as tangled as ever. The horror of the Zodiac Killer, once thought to be a thing of the past, was now a present nightmare. The investigation seemed no closer to a resolution than it had been years ago. The killer had always been a step ahead, and as the years went by, the fear that had once gripped the public now seemed to haunt the police themselves. Would they ever catch him, or would the Zodiac continue to lurk in the shadows forever? The clock ticked endlessly in Detective John M. Lee's office as he sifted through the files, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. He was no closer to solving the Zodiac case than when he'd first started, and with each passing day, the grip of the mystery only tightened. The tip from the inmate, James Hall, had been dismissed by some, but something about it gnawed at Lee. Hall's confession, filled with inconsistencies, was more than just a plea for attention. There was a haunting conviction in his voice that Lee couldn't ignore. And then there was the letter. The most recent one from Zodiac. It was a direct challenge, a taunt that seemed to be aimed squarely at Lee himself. You think you know me, Detective Lee. You think you have all the answers, but you don't. I have been here longer than you know, watching, waiting. You have no idea who you are up against. I will continue to play my game, and you will never win. The words were more personal this time. It was as if the Zodiac had stepped out of the shadows and directly into Lee's mind, into his thoughts. It was a challenge that Lee couldn't ignore. The Zodiac was watching him, playing with him, like a cat with a mouse. Lee's obsession with the case deepened. He could feel the pressure mounting. There was no way to escape the dark pull of the Zodiac Killer. It had become more than just a case to solve. It had become a battle of wits, of survival. But the more he investigated, the more he felt like he was slipping deeper into a labyrinth, each turn leading him farther from the truth. Meanwhile, the Zodiac continued to leave his signature behind. A cryptic note left on a victim's body, a twisted message carved into a tree trunk, a cipher carefully designed to taunt the police. It was as if he was daring them to catch him, daring them to figure him out. But with every clue, there was always another layer, another riddle. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't break the code. In 1978, a series of brutal killings rocked a small town in Nevada, just a few hundred miles from San Francisco. The murders had all the hallmarks of a Zodiac killing young couples, isolated areas, and the same cold, methodical brutality that had marked his previous attacks. But there were no immediate signs linking these killings to the Zodiac. The local police were at a loss, but Lee, haunted by the memory of the letter and Hall's confession, decided to take a closer look. As he arrived in the town, the air was thick with fear. The locals whispered about the killer in their midst, unsure whether they were dealing with a copycat or if the Zodiac had truly returned. Lee met with the local investigators, who had already uncovered some chilling details. The latest victim, a young couple found in a desolate park, had been bound and stabbed repeatedly, much like the Zodiac's past victims. But it wasn't just the method of killing that struck a chord with Lee. It was the chilling detail that the victims' bodies had been posed in a grotesque manner, just like the victims at Lake Herman Road, just like the couples at Blue Rock Springs. Could it be the Zodiac? After all this time, the possibility sent a shiver down Lee's spine. There was no way to know for sure, but as he stared at the gruesome crime scene, he knew one thing: they had to find the killer before he struck again. Lee's investigation took him deep into the heart of the Nevada desert. As he spoke with the families of the victims, he was struck by the similarity between these murders and the ones that had occurred so many years ago in California. The same brutality, the same sickening method. The Zodiac had not just returned, he had come back with a vengeance. The more Lee dug into the town's history, the more he uncovered strange connections to the Zodiac's past. One of the local residents, a reclusive man by the name of Calvin Briggs, had a history of mental illness and had been a person of interest in several previous cases involving the Zodiac. Briggs had always been dismissed as a suspect, but something about him had always seemed off. Now, as Lee combed through Briggs's past, he found disturbing evidence that suggested a link to the killer. Calvin Briggs had lived in San Francisco during the years of the Zodiac killings. He had been in and out of mental hospitals and had a history of violent behavior. He also seemed to have an inexplicable knowledge of the Zodiac's crimes. Even in their early stages, when details had not yet been made public, Briggs was a shadow in the background of the investigation, someone who had been overlooked, someone who had slipped through the cracks. Lee's heart raced as he stared at the file. Could this be the break they had been waiting for? Could Calvin Briggs be the Zodiac Killer? The evidence was circumstantial at best, but the pieces were beginning to fit together. If Briggs was the Zodiac, it would explain why the killer had disappeared for so long. He had been hiding in plain sight, far away from the public eye, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. But as Lee began to gather more information about Briggs, something began to feel wrong. He found himself questioning whether Briggs was the killer or just another victim of the Zodiac's twisted game. What if Briggs had been manipulated, driven mad by the same forces that had created the Zodiac? Lee didn't know how much longer he could keep chasing this phantom. Every lead, every theory, seemed to lead him in a circle. The Zodiac was a master of deception, a ghost who had learned to manipulate the world around him. And with each passing day, Lee felt himself becoming more consumed by the case. The killer was always a step ahead, always watching. It wasn't long before another letter arrived. Lee's hands trembled as he tore open the envelope, the familiar symbol of the Zodiac staring back at him. The letter was short, but it was as menacing as ever. "You are getting closer, Detective Lee, but you are still too far. I have been here all along, and I always will be. You will never stop me. I will always be one step ahead." Lee sat back in his chair, staring at the words. The Zodiac was playing with him again, toying with his mind. But this time, Lee wasn't sure if he was chasing the killer or if the killer was chasing him. He had come so close, yet he was still in the dark. Every answer seemed to lead to another question. As the investigation wore on, Lee found himself growing more paranoid, more obsessed. The lines between the case and his own life began to blur. Was he truly chasing a killer, or was the Zodiac merely a reflection of his own fear, his own obsession? The answer, if there was one, seemed just out of reach. It was late, the kind of late where the streets were silent, the city sleeping, and the air felt heavier, like the darkness itself had weight. Detective John M. Lee sat alone in his apartment, surrounded by boxes of old case files, Zodiac letters pinned to the walls like a madman's journal. Cigarette smoke coiled upward into the dim light, dancing like spirits above his head. He hadn't slept in days. The Zodiac had gotten inside his mind, that much was clear. Lee saw him in every face, heard him in every silence. And the letters, they kept coming. Some were mailed, others left at his door. One had been slid under his windshield wiper during a grocery run. "You looked right at me today, Detective." I waved. You didn't wave back. Lee's stomach turned every time he read those words. That meant Zodiac was watching him, not metaphorically, literally. He was close, but that wasn't even the worst of it. The dreams had started about a week ago. At first, it was just flashes. A woman's scream, headlights in the dark, the sound of leather gloves tightening. But then they became vivid, tangible. He saw victims he'd only ever read about. He watched through the killer's eyes. He felt the blade in his hand, the cold click of a revolver. He'd wake in a cold sweat, heart hammering in his chest. The name Zodiac burned into the inside of his skull. But was it just the case driving him insane? Or was the Zodiac truly inside him, playing games deeper than anyone realized? One night, after another, sleep broken by nightmares, Lee received a call from the Nevada State Hospital. Calvin Briggs, the man he'd suspected as Zodiac, had committed suicide in his cell, hung himself with a belt. No note, no explanation, just gone. Lee didn't speak. He simply hung up the phone and sat in silence, staring at the floor. Briggs's death felt wrong, too easy to clean. That night, Lee drove to the hospital to view the body himself. The coroner showed him the autopsy photos. Everything was consistent with suicide. Everything except one thing. Carved into Briggs's chest, just below the sternum, was a tiny crosshair symbol. The Zodiac's mark. It was carved with a needle. Slow, deliberate. Done before death. Lee stood over the body, skin crawling, trying to understand. Was Briggs, the Zodiac, punishing himself in some twisted religious sacrifice? Or had someone gotten to him, silenced him? A single thought surfaced and refused to let go. What if Briggs wasn't the Zodiac? What if the Zodiac killed him to protect the secret? What if he was warning Lee? Later that week, the first victim in months turned up in Reno. Female, 29, alone, driving home from work. They found her car abandoned at the side of the road, driver's door open, keys still in the ignition. Her body was discovered 3 miles into the forest, staged just like the classic Zodiac killings. Arms splayed wide, mouth taped shut, eyes open, staring skyward. She'd been stabbed 17 times. Under her left hand was a playing card, the Queen of Hearts, soaked in blood. Written across the card in black ink was a single sentence. "Your move, Lee." That was the moment everything broke. The media went wild. For the first time in years, the Zodiac was back on every front page. TV anchors whispered his name like it summoned him. Copycats crawled out of the woodwork. The streets emptied earlier. Locks were double-checked. But the worst of it, Lee was now part of the story. The FBI stepped in. They wanted to take Lee off the case, citing compromised judgment and emotional instability. He hadn't passed his last psych evil. He hadn't told anyone about the hallucinations, the dreams, the letters hand-delivered to his house. They didn't trust him anymore, but the Zodiac did. And that terrified Lee more than anything. The next letter came taped to the inside of Lee's bathroom mirror. No postage, no fingerprints, no entry signs. Just the reflection of Lee's own haunted eyes staring back at these words. "I see you breaking, John. I saw the cracks forming the day you opened my first letter. You've always been close to me. You think like me. You feel what I feel. And soon you'll do what I do." Beneath that, scrawled in what looked like dried blood, "There is no me without you." Lee was unraveling. He started seeing things, reflections that didn't match his movement, shadows that shifted when no one was there. Once, in the station's evidence room, he thought he heard a typewriter clicking softly behind the boxes. When he turned, there was only an old desk, untouched in years, but on it sat a blank page, and the Zodiac symbol scratched faintly in the dust. Was it real? Was any of it? Or had the Zodiac already succeeded in breaking him? By now, Lee had isolated himself. His apartment was dark, the windows sealed with black plastic, maps and photographs littering every surface, strings connecting crime scenes, red circles drawn around dates, times, astrological signs. He barely ate. He stopped returning calls. And that's when the dreams turned into visions. Not when he slept, but when he was awake. He saw the victims before they were killed. Not clearly, more like flashes, a pair of red shoes, a payphone in the rain, a woman's voice whispering, "He's here." Then, always, a hand on his shoulder. He'd spin around, no one, until one night there was someone. He woke from a dream and found himself standing outside, in the woods, barefoot, no coat, and in front of him, nailed to a tree, was a human heart, pinned with a knife, a note attached with a single word. Closer, Lee dropped to his knees. He didn't scream, he didn't cry, he laughed. a hollow, dry sound that echoed through the trees like something dead learning how to speak. Zodiac wasn't just inside his head. He was his head now. The only question that remained, was Lee still chasing the killer? Or had he become him? It rained for 3 days straight. Not a light drizzle, but a relentless pounding, almost biblical downpour. The kind of rain that washed color from the world and left only shadows behind. Detective John M. Lee sat by the window of his darkened apartment, watching the droplets smear the glass like tears sliding down a pale cheek. He hadn't spoken to another person in 72 hours. He hadn't showered in 5 days. The voice in his head, the one he'd spent his entire career chasing, had stopped whispering. Now it spoke clearly. You know what you are. Lee stared at the murder board pinned to his wall, his eyes twitching as they scanned back and forth across timelines, photos, and maps. Names circled, strings of dates, notes in the margins written in his own handwriting. Or was it? He could no longer tell which messages were his, and which belonged to the Zodiac. And then, somewhere beneath the noise in his skull, a single memory resurfaced. His mother, screaming in the middle of the night when he was just a boy. The blood on the kitchen floor. The man who stood over her, face hidden in shadow, wearing dark gloves and a twisted grin. Lee had never remembered his face. But now, he did. And the face looked like himself. He stood suddenly and ripped the photos off the wall, panting, frantic. No, he muttered. No, no, no. I'm not him. I'm not the killer. But even as he said it, the images from his dreams came flooding back. That familiar grip on the knife, the cold air of Lake Berryessa, the screams echoing through the trees. Not as a witness, as the executioner. Lee stumbled into the bathroom and splashed cold water on his face. The mirror showed a reflection he didn't recognize. Sunken eyes, pale skin, blood vessels crawling like webs under his cheeks. Behind him, in the mirror, a figure stood, motionless, wearing a black hood and sunglasses. Lee spun around. No one there. Desperate for clarity, Lee drove to the only person he thought might still trust him, Dr. Elaine Mercer, a forensic psychologist who had helped profile the Zodiac decades ago. She was retired now, but he remembered her words. If the Zodiac is still alive, he's either in prison, or so well hidden, he's become part of the system meant to catch him. When Lee arrived at her isolated cottage, soaked and shaking, she took one look at him and said, "You look like hell, I think. I need you to tell me I'm not him," he whispered. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she made tea, watched him closely, and then finally said, "Why do you think you're the Zodiac?" Lee told her everything. The dreams, the visions, the voices, the letters with no fingerprints, the hallucinations, the way the murders seemed to follow him, how he could predict the next kill without even trying. When he was finished, Mercer stared at him in silence, then asked the only question that mattered. "John, have you ever lost time?" The question hit him like a hammer to the chest. Yes, he had. Hours, sometimes whole nights, gone without explanation. Places he didn't remember visiting. People who swore they'd seen him somewhere he couldn't recall. But the worst, one of the Zodiac letters, dated 1974, postmarked in Oakland. Lee had been in Oakland that week, on a case, but no one could remember which one, not even him. Mercer led him to a mirror, handed him an old photo, one of the police sketches of Zodiac, drawn from survivor accounts. She held it up beside his reflection. "You've changed over the years," she said, "but the bone structure, the jawline, the eye sockets, She didn't finish. She didn't have to. Lee staggered back, like he'd been punched. It was him, or someone who looked exactly like him. A relative, a twin. Was he the Zodiac's son? A fragment of a dissociative mind? Was the Zodiac real at all? That night, Lee returned home and found a box waiting on his doorstep. No label, no postage. Inside was a re-alteral audio tape and a note. "Play me, John. Let's remember together." He didn't hesitate. He threaded the reel into his old player, something he hadn't touched in years, and hit play at first. Static, then a man's voice. Calm, measured. His voice. I remember the first one, how her skin felt, how the scream started, then caught in her throat, like she didn't believe it was real. I remember the silence after that perfect silence. That was the moment I became me. Lee fell to his knees. It was his voice, talking like he wasn't himself. But then came a second voice, colder, raspier, whispering. "You let me in, John. Long ago, when you saw your mother bleed, you made a space for me, and I've lived there ever since." The tape ended with a sound that made Lee's blood freeze. Laughter, not human, not animal, somewhere in between. He was two people. One was a man who wanted to stop evil. The other was evil. And now the barrier between them was gone. There was one more letter on his desk, sealed in wax. He didn't remember writing it, but he knew it was from him, to himself. He opened it with trembling fingers. "You've hunted me long enough. Now let's stop pretending. You were never chasing me. You were chasing your shadow, and now it's your turn to finish what we started." Lee looked at his hands. They were shaking, covered in something dark. He smelled iron, looked down, blood, still warm. He didn't know whose, didn't know when. Only that somewhere, someone was screaming, and he was smiling. John M. Lee had always believed in justice. Now he wasn't sure if it had ever existed, or if it was just a story good men told themselves before the dark came. The blood on his hands had dried. Still, he didn't know where it had come from. He hadn't checked the news. He hadn't checked the street outside. He didn't want to know, because deep down, he already did. He was no longer hunting the Zodiac. He was the Zodiac. Or at least, half of him was. There was one place left to go. The cabin, the one from the dreams. The one that returned night after night, burned into his subconscious like a brand. He didn't remember building it, didn't remember buying it, but he remembered the inside. The walls lined with newspaper clippings, the radio that only played static, the trapdoor under the floorboards. So, when he pulled off the highway and drove deep into the Sierra woods, past roads that weren't on any map, through fog so thick it felt like driving through memory, he wasn't surprised when the cabin appeared exactly where it had always been, waiting. The door creaked open without resistance. Inside, the air was stale with rot and dust and something older. Lee stepped across the threshold like a man walking into his own grave. Everything was exactly as he remembered. The couch with the torn cushion, the oil lamp with the crack in its base, the record player, needle resting at the edge of a vinyl labeled in black ink. Lee's lament, he didn't touch it, not yet. He crossed the room, pulled back the carpet, and opened the trapdoor. A wooden staircase descended into darkness, and he followed it. The basement smelled of mold and dried copper. The walls were covered in photographs. Polaroids, victims, crime scenes, newspaper headlines, but also him. Pictures of Lee at his desk, Lee at the store, Lee sleeping. Lee staring into the camera, unaware it was even there. In the center of the room sat an old reel projector, already loaded. A single chair faced the screen, and on that screen, frozen in anticipation, was a frame of his childhood home. The projector clicked on by itself, and the film began to play. He watched, unable to look away. At first it was home videos, his mother singing in the kitchen, his father smoking on the porch. Then, the night it all broke. The Zodiac appeared on screen, wearing a mask, walking through the house. Lee remembered this dream, except now, he wasn't dreaming. He watched the Zodiac raise a knife, watched his mother scream, but then the killer turned toward the camera, removed the mask, and the face beneath it was John. A younger John, 8 years old, eyes blank, expression calm, covered in blood. Lee fell out of the chair. His mind screamed, No, that's not how it happened. I was just a boy, I didn't. But he had. The voice inside him spoke clearly now. You didn't survive that night, John. You were born from it. Another letter sat on the floor beside the projector. This one wasn't sealed, just folded. He opened it. The paper was old, yellowed, written in handwriting he now accepted as his own. It read, There were two of us all along. You, the part that begged for justice. Me, the part that found pleasure in screams. But only one of us can survive now. So choose, John. Choose. The cabin shook. Thunder cracked overhead. The storm had followed him. Inside, the walls began to bleed. Or maybe that was just in his head. It didn't matter anymore. Reality was fractured. Lee stood in the middle of it, eyes burning with truth, hands trembling. He looked down. There were 2 guns on the table. One marked L, one marked Z. He didn't remember placing them there, but they were waiting. A voice whispered in his ear, Only one bullet, only one future. Which one are you? Lee closed his eyes. Tears cut down his cheeks. He remembered every victim, every scream, every letter. Every night he had felt the killer breathing down his neck, because the breath had always been his own. The Zodiac wasn't real. Or maybe he was more real than anyone had ever imagined. Because he lived inside people, inside the cracks, inside the pain. And now it was time to end it. A gunshot tore through the night. The cabin fell silent. Days passed, then weeks. No one ever found the body. No one ever reported the cabin. But a new letter arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle, typed, perfectly spaced, with one sentence. We always were 2 sides of the same coin, but only one of us gets to keep spinning. It was signed, Z. No one could ever prove John M. Lee was the Zodiac. His files disappeared. His apartment was empty. And somewhere, in the dark corners of the world, the killer either ended or began again.